Welcome everyone to this interview with Professor Kathleen Lyons, who has graciously agreed to talk to us about accessible pedagogy for the Hostos WAC program. Dr. Kathleen Lyons is an assistant professor of rhetoric and composition at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey. At FDU, she also serves as the assistant director of writing in the Florham campus, or at the Florham campus. She enjoys teaching first-year writing as well as classes on disability rhetoric and technical and professional communication. In her leadership and teaching role, she prioritizes accessibility and mindfulness to support student learning and community building. Currently, Dr. Lyons' research explores the role of writing instructors as access makers in higher education. So thank you, Kathleen, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to chat and talk about accessibility.
And just to introduce ourselves, I'm Valerie Fryer-Davis, a WAC fellow at the Hostos Community College. And I'm joined with my colleague Natasha Tiniacos, who is also another WAC fellow at Hostos Community College. Let's just start with thinking about just access. So in your dissertation, you talk about a techne of access, and I'm just wondering if you could explain sort of what this is and why it's important to accessibility pedagogy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's easiest to break it down into those keywords of techne and access. And starting with techne, which is coming from the classical rhetorical tradition, where I really think about it as a process of making and doing. So some scholars who help me think about that are Kelly Pender, Jacqueline Rhodes, and Jonathan Alexander, and then a recent book by Patricia Fancher about queer techne. But she talks a lot about embodied experiences and how the process and of, you know, being a human in the world, we gain knowledge from that. And so it's that idea of developing and inventing through our embodied experiences. And so that's the techne piece of it. Some examples might be sewing or quilting, the kind of more craft examples that are traditional. And then when I think about it with access, access is this highly rhetorical and embodied experience where, in disability studies scholarship, thinking about Tanya Titchkosky's work, it's thinking about how we participate in our surroundings and in our environment. And, sometimes it's inaccessible. There are barriers to that participation. And sometimes where it's about how we're interacting, how something's designed, and access also being something that is coming can be very bodily, right? So together, a techne of access, I'm thinking about it as an embodied experience and this knowledge that we gain from seeking access and then creating accessible materials. And when they come together for me, it really encourages invention in the composition classroom. I was thinking specifically about accessible writing pedagogy at the time. So it encourages those embodied experiences we have, whether it's a relationship with a student who's seeking access and we're accommodating or we're redesigning something to be more accessible. Those experiences, that's techne. And that creates entry points, I think, for us to continue building and developing accessible practices.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lyons, for extending this dialogue. We were curious, how did you become involved in this research? If you can expand on that, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I was in my first semester of I went to the University of Delaware for my PhD, and I took a disability and composition class with Stephanie Kirschbaum, and it just totally changed how I saw the world. And I grew up, I'm dyslexic and I have a learning disability. And so I grew up thinking about access in the classroom, from my own experiences and the testing and accommodations and process that I went through. So I always had learning disability conversations in my life, but the class really helped me think more about the design of our world and why, and how things were set up. And so, one of the books that we read in that class was Amy Hamre's Building Access and thinking about what designs are assumed to be neutral, and what bodies are assumed to be occupying spaces, who's going to be there, what needs are they're going to have, and how do we design a space for that, or who are we not designing spaces for? So that's where it started, was in grad school that very first semester. Um, and then since then, I think just having conversations, now in my faculty and writing program administrator role, I'm having conversations with faculty all the time about accessibility. And one of the main responses I get is, well, I don't know how to do that, or I don't know how to caption a video. So that how-to knowledge seemed to be the immediate response of, I'm not doing accessible pedagogy because I don't know how. So that was also kind of where that research motivation and inspiration came from, was people around me saying, well, I just don't know how. Uh, so that's where the Technē piece also came valuable.
At Hostos, we've been thinking a lot about anti-racism in the past few years and also queer pedagogy. And so I'm wondering a little bit about if you could speak a little bit more about how you address the intersectionality of disability, anti-racism, and queer pedagogy.
Yeah, I love this question. For me, the connection, and I always come back to embodiment and embodied experiences, and how rhetoric helps us understand our embodiment, how we relate to others, differences in embodiment, um, and that helps me think about the multidimensional aspects of accessibility, or how disability pedagogy, I think you also asked about anti-racist and queer pedagogy, how they intersect. For me, it's all about that embodied experience and sharing those, and learning from those who are similar and different from us. When we talk about them, I hope we all talk about them together, right? Is because they all help us think about norms. What is the norm? What is a hidden or assumed or dominated narrative that's happening? And so how can we push against those norms? How can we be more inclusive? And I think disability pedagogy, anti-racist, and queer pedagogy all help us do that really well.
You're so right. Dr. Linson also is so interested to think this intersectionality, and at the same time, we ask, no, and we ask you if you can illuminate us a little bit. How do we employ accessible pedagogy across disciplines, no, and why it is important to be transdisciplinary while doing this work? If you can share with us, that would be
Yeah.
insightful.
Absolutely. And I think it continues from that last question of the multiple dimensions of how we're thinking in different practices. And so for me, access is transdisciplinary. It's something that is going to be in every classroom, or should be, right? You're going to have disabled students and faculty in every class, in every major, in every discipline, right? Whether someone is disclosing that, whether it's visible or invisible, it's there. For me, when I did my research study for the dissertation, I purposely interviewed people who were teaching first year writing, but also technical and professional communication, because while they're kind of sometimes operate as different spaces, disciplinary wise, a lot of the conversations about disability and access are coming from composition studies, and then going back and forth and thinking about design in terms of technical and professional communication. So the methods, the ideas, the theories, that's for me where that transdisciplinary aspect is um, really important for accessible pedagogy, because then that enables us to have a culture of access where it's not just in the writing program, it's in the entire university. We're all thinking about a culture of access, and it's the responsibility and relationships are not siloed.
So I wanted to ask a specific question sort of about your second chapter of your dissertation, um, where you study writing teachers as access makers. This is something that you mentioned as is a big part of your research, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like what this looks like and what this means as for teachers to be access makers.
That idea of writing teachers being access makers might be a friction point for some people in terms of, well, is it the writing teacher's responsibility? But what I think makes writing instructors really unique is the transferability of knowledge that we use writing for. And so I think when we pair writing and access, that transdisciplinary part of what writing is, access is tied to it. And I think this a really helpful way to think about it is um, if I'm teaching in a first year writing class, a multimodal assignment, and as part of that assignment, I'm also asking students when they make a video to caption the video. When there is an image, they're doing an image description. So if that is something that I'm teaching and we're dialoguing about, and its students are aware of the practices, they're thinking about the embodied experience of their audience, what senses are being engaged when I do a podcast. If I don't transcribe that podcast, it's not accessible to everybody, right? If there's a sound or something in that podcast, how am I describing it? So really, students start thinking about the rhetorical moves they're making in a multimodal composition piece, and then that knowledge transfers just as how they're thinking about their audience when they go and they're in their discipline and then in the future career when they're making a presentation or when they are creating job materials, a resume, a cover letter, they're thinking about their audience in a really critical way. And then they're also bringing that access knowledge, right? That idea of transcribing and thinking about audience experience, embodied experience to that workplace. So that's really where I think writing teachers as access makers happens. It's not just the teacher in the responsibility of creating an accessible materials and assignments and using accessible pedagogy, but it's also in that wonderful knowledge that students are then going to bring with them that's tied with the rhetorical awareness of accessibility for their audience, whether it's in the workplace, with a friend. I've had so many students, one of my favorite moments is when we go on, Instagram or um, a social media page or something, and we start looking at alt text. And they're like, I didn't even know I could create alt text for an Instagram post. And then they start doing that in their regular practice. And that is one of my favorite moments.
Exactly, and I think going back to the pandemic, we used to do everything was on Zoom conference classes, and I saw everybody started to describe how they look, what they were wearing, and I really love that practice. And I have, I actually forgot it in our interview, but it's something that I would like to cultivate as well. And you mentioned earlier, Dr. Lyons, that even when you are talking with colleagues, they might say, I don't implement accessible pedagogy because I just don't know how to. And we were wondering if you could share with us suggestions on how, practical suggestions, no, for teachers who are new to accessible pedagogy and want to implement it in the classrooms.
I think when somebody is interested in accessible pedagogy, or whether it's like a deep dive or I need a couple things, right? I really want to ask them more to reflect on how they're thinking and approaching it. So the practice actually that I would suggest is thinking about how you're making materials accessible or experiences that you've had with students where they've inquired for or asked for an accommodation, asked for more time on something, or asked for materials ahead of time. Or maybe they brought the accommodation letter and you're like, I don't know what to do with this. We don't have time tests. So asking people to reflect on those moments and asking, what's one thing that you might work on to make accessible in your classroom? Is it your grading practice? Is it revision and feedback? Is it the multimodal assignment? Maybe you already have one, but you're not having a conversation about accessibility. Maybe you're using videos, but they're not captioned. So I think asking someone to just kind of reflect first on, well, this is going to be an ongoing process. So if we approach it, that Technē of Access piece, approach it as a process of making, what's something you're already doing that maybe you could improve, or maybe there's something that you already encountered that you can reflect on and shift a little bit. So I have three focal areas that I encourage people, and they're really everyday things that we already use in our everyday language. So one example would be making sense. This is a phrase that we use, often tied to revision or peer review. Oh, I want to make sure that my essay makes sense. And so just I would encourage people to pause and say, well, what do you mean by making sense? What's your idea or definition of making sense? What's the assumption behind the logic piece of making sense? What conventions is it tied to? Are there multiple ways of making sense in this example? Or when we think about um, what senses we're using, I talked about multimodality before. What are the senses students are using to learn and engage? So how are students making sense of your classroom? What senses are engaged? And so I think bringing that multimodal content is always a really helpful. Multimodality and accessibility to me are just prime to go together. So really my practical advice is to think about that process of making and think about something you might change. One of the go-to suggestions people usually use is universal design for learning. I would say that is like the buzz accessible pedagogy. And it serves its purpose, right? I think conversations about universal design for learning in composition and rhetoric served as this intervention to start talking about accessibility and accessible pedagogy. But when I get people who maybe, they're already overwhelmed, they're already overworked, they're already at multiple institutions. And so there's a barrier to using universal design for learning for them. Instead, think about accessible pedagogy as a process of making. And that's where you're going to go to your experiences and your relationships that are already there.
I think, and also making that manageable is so, so important, especially with the increased adjunctification of labor in our university system. Like at CUNY, it's an absurdly high number of faculty members who are entirely adjuncts. I don't know the exact numbers, but um, I see what you're saying. Like looking at universal design, it's just so overwhelming. But making small shifts, I think that's really, really great. And speaking of, if we're kind of broaching the topic of sort of the political situation, right, with the adjunctification of labor, in our current political climate, why is it so important? Why is it so important to implement a Technē of Access for social justice, especially given the context of an ongoing pandemic that is a mass disabling event, and also the university framework of accessibility that really focuses mostly on medical documentation?
Yeah. I
Sorry, big question.
No, it's such an important one, and I paused there to let it have its weight, I think there's also this mapping of knowledge that happens when we start thinking about Techne. And part of that map is the Western colonial, white male dominated discourse
Exactly.
in higher ed, right? So I don't want to just ditch it and say, oh, it's not there, it's not part of the narrative, right? But if I can use disability studies, use critical disability studies as a methodology, and then map that, and we can start to have conversations about what knowledge is privileged and what knowledge is dominated in
Mm,
academia, and how we labor. I think that gives us not just the map, but also the questions and remaking of those knowledge practices and building and um, where did the practice or knowledge come from? And there's been this recent shift, at least I think in disability studies, where people are starting to cite disability justice activists. And there's also a conversation there of um, kind of appropriating it in academia. And so I think a Technē of Access encourages us to have those conversations of where did it come from? Where did this knowledge come from? Where did this term come from? How am I using it? How am I citing? What are the norms and marginalizations and relationships that we have? And if we think about it in terms of teaching and social justice, we really start to ask questions, critical questions about our practices. And this goes back to our conversation about intersectionality. An anti-racist approach to assessment isn't enough. We need an intersectional piece to that, right? Um,
mm,
it's a really valuable conversation, and I think um that's where the multiplicity is so important, and that's why social justice is so important because it's not just one person, it's a collective, right? It's not just one identity or one framework. It's that intersection that's really going to help us think about think about structures or systems such as you asked about accommodation or medical documentation that's required
Yeah.
in university. Well, who has access to the testing, um, thinking even just financial barriers right there. Um, and I'm also thinking about first generation college students in that piece as well. Knowing where to go, that the laws are and the support is different from K through 12 to higher
Mhm.
ed. And um, so I think that's also when we're thinking about the medical piece and the disability piece, the intersection of social justice as not just one or one person or one silo, but collectively, how are we thinking about access and what are we requiring, such as attendance policies or why I also paused was just because I have my own grappling with the word techne and I've kind of shifted recently to thinking about making and
Uh,
what happens if I use techne versus the word making? What's the relationship between making and labor? You mentioned, you know, the adjunct labor, and I think when we're talking about accessible pedagogy, that idea of labor is such an important part of that conversation that I don't know if Techne allows me to fully get there. Um,
mm,
maybe it helps me ask the question, or maybe it helps give guidance towards, okay, what's making what's the difference between making something accessible and laboring to work towards accessibility, right? That those pieces matter. Um,
A lot of what I really love about especially the last part of what you were saying, was that we have to make the classroom accessible not just for our students, but also for us as well.
yeah, and that's where I think the universal design for learning conversation is connected to the culture of access conversation because you may be teaching at one university where they're supporting, ungrading or labor-based grading, or they have workshops on universal design for learning, or they have a syllabus template that's already, the accessible document design's already there. You just kind of pick it up and put um, your piece into it. And you could go to another institution where they don't have resources or they are trying or um, maybe there's structures in place that require traditional grading. So it's also, and as an adjunct or, I'm an early career, for me coming to my institution, I had to think about what risks I can take. And so I think that's another piece of it as well.
has stayed the most with me so far is making sense, but sense according to what?
Mhm.
That's like, wow. It's like, I imagine starting a semester with that conversation with your students and creating in the community of that classroom an idea of what is accessible pedagogy, maybe, no?
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
or brainstorming what is that, how do we feel, how is our embodied. I am a learn, this is new after a conversation, after listening to you, so I'm very thankful. And I don't have any more questions. I think I'm in gratitude with you and my colleague Valerie for this conversation.
Thank you. And I love how you're thinking about it in terms of a conversation with students because that's the piece of the relationships that I'm not sure I clearly conveyed earlier, but I think the students' embodied experiences in the room, right? What they're bringing with them, that collaborative conversation you're just pointing to. Um, I love that. That's wonderful because students, I think, will use that phrase as well. Oh, I want to make sure my essay makes sense. What do you mean by that? And why? You know?
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you once again, Dr. Lyons. This was an amazing conversation. Thank you for your time and for your expertise.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to join you and um, think with you.